Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ruth Wishart. It's my very great pleasure to be chairing this event at the Edinburgh International Book Festival. And actually, you're foregathered for something of a world first. Today's guest opens the acknowledgement page of his new book with the words, "I don't think anyone's going to be very keen to be associated with this book." And the clue to that perhaps lies in its title, "The Phony Victory, the World War II Illusion." And indeed, within its pages, many interpretations of that conflict are put under the merciless microscope of his researches, from Dunkirk to the origins of our post-war relations with the United States, which he contends were always more cynical than special. He offers us a picture of Britain still painting itself in the lavish colours of supposed former glories, even if its influence dwindles into embarrassing irrelevance. And he has a harsh analysis of other episodes, such as the serial bombing of German civilians and the fall of Singapore. This, in short, is a book which will win him few popularity contests among those who prefer the warm blanket of mythology to the unsparing cold shower of reality. I don't think he'll mind any of that. Unusually, he's on my left. Please welcome the journalist. Please welcome
That means she's on my right.
Please welcome the journalist, author, and the serial controversialist, Peter Hitchens.
Thank you. I'll do this bit standing up, if I might, and if anybody can't hear me now is the time to say. This is fundamentally about war. I was brought up believing that war was, well, pretty good, really. This was the whole nature of my post-war childhood, the great triumph over Hitler, the finest hour, all the wonderful things which had apparently happened, which had led us to the bright new sunlit uplands in which we lived. But since then, I've found out that war isn't quite as good as I had previously thought. I am not one of those journalists who seeks to go to war zones. The opposite is the case. If anybody starts discussing war zones, I hide from the sight of any news editor or foreign editor who can be seen. But I have by accident wandered into a couple. Once in Romania at the fall of Ceausescu, when I visited the hospitals and saw the results of what can happen to people in filthy backward hospitals when they've been shot. And later on in Vilnius in Lithuania, where Mikhail Gorbachev let the KGB loose on the people, and I found out what a human head looks like after a bullet has passed through it. And I began from that point, really, to be less enthusiastic about war. And then I found repeatedly that I was surrounded by people who seemed to be keen on it. They were keen on the Kosovo War. Many people still are. They were keen to begin with on the Iraq War. They were then keen again on the Libyan War, on the Afghanistan War. I frequently meet people who denounce me as an apologist for the Assad state in Syria, because I'm not keen on involving this country in a war in Syria. And it remains a popular thing in this country, and it's popular in a very odd way. People all believe that all wars are the same, that we are perpetually trapped in what I call Munich syndrome. It's 1938. I, the politician who wants war, am Winston Churchill, or alternatively Franklin Roosevelt. You, the person who doesn't want war, are Neville Chamberlain, the feeble, cowardly appeaser. And he, the person on whom I wish to make war, is Hitler. And not merely is this myth generally totally untrue and bears no relation whatsoever to the facts, but as I considered this, I began to realize that the whole myth of 1938 and 1939 did not hold together. And I began, not as a historian, which I'm not, but as a journalist, to examine what was available on these events to find out what actually happened, and I found out that it was not true what we believed. The finest hour was, in fact, the finest hour, and before anybody runs away with the impression that I'm suggesting that we should have made peace with Hitler in 1940, I believe, and will believe till my dying day, that the most important thing that Winston Churchill ever did was to refuse to make that peace. What does need to be asked, however, is why Britain, at that stage, one of the most prosperous, militarily and diplomatically powerful nations on earth, backed by an enormous empire, was, in May 1940, prostrate at the feet of Nazi Germany. How had we blundered into this extraordinary situation? From that beginning point, I re-examined the whole thing. This book is not a happy book. It is in some ways an antidote to 3,000 hagiographical biographies of Winston Churchill, the latest of which, by Andrew Roberts, has of course been published to huge acclaim and vast sales, the opposite of my own experience. This is, I should point out, the first occasion on which I've addressed a large audience on this book, the first major festival at which I've spoken about it. It was reviewed in one major publication, if you can call the New Statesman major, which I suppose, if we're being kind, we will do, by somebody who, well, I won't say what I would have said, because who can prove it, by somebody who actually honestly believed it was a Eurosceptic book written to please the patriotic readers of the Mail on Sunday. Any reader of it who actually gets to the end may find this to be, how shall I put it, a possibly mistaken summary. Anyway, that's an introduction. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a surrenderist. I'm not a Hitler apologist. I'm not, in fact, even an appeaser. I'm just somebody who thinks that a country which hides its own past from itself will never, ever manage its own present, let alone make its way healthily into the future. Thank you very much.
Peter, I'm going to start with a couple of quotes from your book, which I'd like you to kind of deconstruct. One is, it's surely time to recognize that the good war was often incompetently fought with outdated equipment by a country in decline as well as wrongly directed. And the other thing I want to throw up at this early stage is, this was a country that deliberately sought a war of choice over a bad issue at a bad time. Its leaders did so mainly in the vain hope of preserving a great power status its rulers knew in their hearts was already lost. Explain.
Okay, a lot of this I owe to somebody called Simon Newman, whom I've never met, and who wrote an extraordinary piece of work as his PhD thesis called The British Guarantee to Poland of 1939. And his analysis of what took place and of what was going through the minds of the British government at the time that we made this guarantee to Poland is devastating. And if you can get hold of it, which is very difficult, I recommend it to you. But what runs through it and what shocked me in the way that, sitting late at night over a book, sometimes something really does deliver a shock to the mind, was the discovery that not merely, because this is easily discovered, not merely had we made a guarantee to Poland which we had no intention whatsoever of fulfilling. We could not have helped Poland in 1939 if we'd wanted to. We didn't plan to do so. Our military leaders knew that we couldn't. Our political leaders knew that we couldn't. Yet we still made this guarantee. Not merely did that guarantee give Poland control over the exact time and place of the beginning of the Second World War, which it did. That's also known. But that we made the guarantee because we were afraid that Poland would come to a friendly understanding with Nazi Germany. And we were worried that we would therefore not have a pretext for a war, which we sought because we wished to reassert our position as a major power. And this is clear from minutes of cabinet meetings and of discussions between major figures in British foreign policy at the time. I would fundamentally attribute it to Lord Halifax, though it's quite clear that Neville Chamberlain was involved in it in the first place. The incompetence arises from this very simple point. Neville Chamberlain is very wrongly portrayed as having left the country unprepared for war. Actually, Neville Chamberlain spent billions by today's standards on modernizing Britain's armed forces in the late 1930s. But he modernized them for a completely different war from the one that we had. When he began his process, he modernized the Navy to protect the Empire and the Air Force to protect the home islands from attack. If you think about it, the Spitfire, that great totem of wartime glory, is a defensive weapon, not an offensive one. It has no use in offensive warfare. It has only any use as a defensive weapon. And also the other really great and praiseworthy development of British military technology of the late 1930s, radar. Again, it's a defensive weapon, not an offensive one. And he developed these, and as I say, the Navy was greatly expanded and modernized. But what we did not have, and specifically decided in 1936 not to have, was a large land army with powerful armor. We had nothing of that kind, and yet we found ourselves suddenly spinning into a war a major land war on the continent of Europe against a country which did have a powerfully equipped and heavily armoured land army, which we could not conceivably resist. And that's the incompetence. And it's extraordinary when you look at it. And the other thing about the Second World War, it lasted for 6 years. Between June 1940 and June 1944, the British Army was never once in direct contact with the main body of the enemy. So for 4 years of a 6-year war, we weren't actually fighting the enemy directly. The war dissipated itself into what actually turned out to be irrelevant conflicts in North Africa, and in a huge defeat, which we've largely forgotten, by the Japanese in Singapore in 1942. The actual war which we claimed to have fought against Hitler, we were irrelevant to during large parts of it. So again, the moment you begin to look at it, you see that what you were taught to believe doesn't make sense. How did we move from phony war to being the great victors of 1945? Why is it that the country that we supposedly entered the war to save, Poland, wasn't permitted to take part in the 1945 victory parade in London? Again, every single aspect of this, when questioned, falls to pieces. So why do we believe this myth? And why do we continue to comfort ourselves with untruths?
I think I'd like to have been a fly in the wall when you were watching the 70th anniversary commemorations earlier this year. But I think what you're saying in the book is that there are several myths, as you have it, Dunkirk as a kind of glorious retreat, or even though it was a retreat, the Battle of Britain, and indeed our naval campaigns. And in all of these three instances about which we've evinced huge pride, in all of them you've said that actually they were pretty well disasters.
Well, I accept the Navy. I come from a naval family, and I will say this very simple thing. In the book, I mention this very important thing. In the battles of Narvik, which were mainly destroyer battles, in which a particular destroyer captain called Warburton Lee distinguished himself immensely in the Nelson tradition, the German Navy's destroyer capacity was wiped off the surface of the sea. And as a result, it was impossible thereafter for Germany even to contemplate an invasion of this country, in my view. And that was the conduct of the Navy, which was the best equipped, the best trained, and the best commanded of all the services, seems to me to be the least subject to criticism. The Battle of Britain did undoubtedly involve many acts of distinguished bravery by individuals, and many of them British, many of them also Polish and Czech, and no one should ever try to take that away from them. But the idea that it was a possible prelude to invasion, the idea that it was in response to a systematic attack by the Germans, doesn't actually stand up to reality. You have to go into the book to see the details. But what the Germans were trying to do in the summer of 1940 was to demoralize us into making peace, not to prepare us for an invasion. No serious preparations for an invasion of this country were ever made. The Germans never possessed a single landing craft. The German Navy and the German Army could not even agree on the breadth of the planned invasion or the way in which it should be conducted, and did their very best to sabotage each other's efforts. And the plan to invade this country, such as it was effectively abandoned long before the end of the summer of 1940. So the peril in which we supposedly stood did not come from that direction.
And in fact, when you talk about Dunkirk, you ask the question, how was it that the British Army was up to what in Edinburgh we would call
up to its armpits in salt water, yeah.
Oxters, I think, was the word.
Billions of pounds of equipment left abandoned on the beaches, yeah.
Yeah.
How? Because of incompetence, because it should never have been there in the first place. It was a complete absurdity, and it fulfilled no military purpose, and it was a huge defeat. Of course, it was right for the saving of national morale that it should have been portrayed as something else. But the soldiers themselves, in many cases, expected to be jeered by contemptuous mobs when they arrived home, and were amazed to discover they were being treated as heroes. It was
so
a defeat.
when you hear some of your colleagues in the media describe the need for to recapture the Dunkirk spirit, you're perhaps...
I inwardly sigh. What can one do? What is there to recapture? The Dunkirk spirit was to the extent that it existed, was an attempt to sustain ourselves after a total and unmitigated defeat.
Can we look for a minute at our relationship with the States, and most particularly the negotiations between Churchill and Roosevelt?
It is astonishing. Again, the issue of the convoys of gold. This country was stripped of its. In fact, the British Empire was stripped of its life savings in gold and negotiable securities, and indeed in businesses we owned in North America, in a kind of raid by bailiffs by the United States. And it was only when Henry Morgenthau went to the Senate and said, basically, if we don't give them Lend-Lease, these guys are going to have to stop fighting. And only after he had personally satisfied the Senate by showing them the accounts that Britain had no money left, that any kind of aid began. And for a long time after the beginning of Lend-Lease, very little, apart from a certain amount of dried eggs, made its way here at all. And Lend-Lease, the entire time that it existed, was at a level which allowed us to continue to fight, but which did not allow us to rebuild our economy. And it was deliberately kept at that level. We were a pensioner of the United States, and the treatment of Churchill by Roosevelt at the famous Placentia Bay meeting in Newfoundland was also astonishingly harsh. And the document now known as the Atlantic Charter, in fact, contained many serious, lasting diplomatic defeats for this country. The attitude of the United States towards Britain during all this period was not one of shoulder-to-shoulder love and friendship. And why should it have been? I'll say this here, many people will actually inwardly and maybe outwardly protest if I say this and say I'm wrong, but I'm not. Britain has never repaid its First World War debts to the United States. They remain unpaid. Repayment ceased in the early 1930s. And resentment about this, together with all the other many resentments present among large minorities in the United States, the Irish-American minority, the German-American minority particularly, against Britain, meant that we were an unpopular country, regarded as snobbish, effete, and indeed unreliable, and as having inveigled the United States into the First World War by slick propaganda. And it was not by any means a relationship of friendship. It was a cold relationship of mutual use in which we were very much the junior partners, and remained so ever after. So
how do you characterize the involvement of the Americans in the war? I mean, what do you regard their impact?
The United States had tried and then failed to stabilize Europe after the First World War, and not by any means wholly disinterestedly. And this had not worked out, so I think the view of the Roosevelt administration particularly was that they should try again and do it properly this time. But again, this was not done in Britain's interest. It was done in the interest of the United States, which wanted, amongst other things, a united Europe, and put a huge amount of pressure. And this is very awkward for some conservatives who are Americophiles. They put a huge amount of pressure on this country to join the European Union from the very start. And there are actually documents dating from the early 1950s showing the CIA's involvement in efforts to do so. And they've continued. So it's not out of any benevolent spirit, but because they simply felt it was time that all the jostling and rivalry in Europe came to an end. They wanted Europe as a useful trading partner, as a bloc against the Soviet Union, but their concern for this country was minimal, as it remains.
I'd like to look at why some of the things that happened then have had such a potent impact on some of the things that have happened subsequently. Now, for instance, you mentioned earlier on, you were talking about Neville Chamberlain, that he was unfairly criticised as an appeaser. And you make the point that what was apparently unforgivable in Chamberlain, characterised as appeasement, was suddenly really rather a good idea if you were looking at Northern Ireland or if you were looking at South Africa.
Well, that is true. Appeasement doth never prosper, for if it prosper, no one dare call it appeasement. But there are many instances of appeasement in the modern world. The principal one, which I make myself very unpopular by pointing out, is the collapse of the British government, supposedly as United Nations Security Council member, nuclear power, in the face of gelling light blackmailed by the Irish Republican Army in 1998, in what is blasphemously called the Good Friday Agreement. It's plainly appeasement of the First Order. The other really popular form of appeasement in the modern world is the constant pressure by Western countries on Israel to give real land away for paper peace. And again, this is standard boilerplate, what everybody believes. And the other great instance of appeasement, which everybody thinks was great, was when Boris Yeltsin failed to do anything about the huge broken promises of the NATO countries not to expand eastwards in the 1990s, and just sat there and let it happen to him. And everybody thinks that was great. And when Vladimir Putin said, "I'm not appeasing you anymore," he became the worst villain in the world. So appeasement is popular. We like it. And appeasement was also popular when Winston Churchill appeased Stalin at Yalta in 1945. So, and that was an immense act of appeasement in which millions of people were carted off into permanent slavery and KGB subjugation for the sake of our well-being in Western Europe. Nobody cares a bit. So appeasement is a misunderstood thing which people don't look at very much.
You also made the point when you spoke initially that that we've used the spirit of Second World War, however mythological, we've used that spirit as an alibi, as an excuse, as an impetus towards other conflicts.
Well, what we do is the great mistake we make is to characterize it as a good war, as if it's morally uncomplicated. And who can deny that the overthrow of Nazi Germany was a good thing in itself, which everybody would have wished for? But it's a bit difficult to make out that it's a good war when you recognize something which we often push to the back of our minds and even deny. A shocking thing at the 75th anniversary of D-Day the other day. I don't care whether Vladimir Putin is invited there or not. I couldn't give a toss about him, but it seemed to me to be utterly insulting that no representative was there of the huge numbers of Russians who died fighting at the other end of Europe. Absolutely no acknowledgement was made of this. We hide this fact from ourselves, partly, I think, because we don't like to remember that we only managed to defeat the worst tyrant in modern European history by forming an alliance with the second worst tyrant in modern history. But we did, and it's undoubtedly true. We also like to quite rightly, state our superiority to the Germans who engaged in the industrial mass murder of European Jews and of many other people as well, and quite rightly. It was an appalling thing beyond all measure, the worst act in Europe and possibly the world maybe of all time, and standing in its own class. But we can't, by stating this, absolve ourselves of the lesser misdeeds of which we ourselves are guilty. I myself cannot, and I've tried to do it, I cannot find a moral justification for our policy of deliberately killing German women and children in their homes by crushing them or burning them to death, which we pursued over many years. I can't do it. And the other thing which I can't countenance is the Potsdam Agreement and the mass deportations or ethnic cleansing of Germans, again, in almost all cases, women, children, and old men, in which untold numbers died violently after the war was over. You cannot actually, once you know anything about this war, claim it to have been a good war. A just war, I think you can pretty much accept that it was a just war, but it was hellish, and many of the hellish things that happened in it were done by us, and we must never forget that. And that has nothing to do with the fact that the other side was more hellish.
Do you remember when you told me not to let you ramble on?
I did.
I just want to tease out a couple of the things that you referred to then. One was their selective amnesia, perhaps, about what happened to the Russian troops and the Leningrad siege and all of that. But the other one was the rationale. I'm interested to know what you thought the rationale was for civilian bombings of the major cities in Germany.
Well, the interesting thing about the bombing of Germany is that we really, for the most part, concealed from ourselves, and indeed from many of the people who were conducting it, exactly what its purpose was. When the air crews were shown their targets for tonight, they would be shown factories and military establishments on the map. The truth was that they couldn't hit a barn door, indeed they couldn't hit a football pitch. The British bombing of Germany was almost totally inaccurate. And what we did was we bombed cities, and after a while we did it under the influence of Frederick Lindemann, later Lord Cherwell, Churchill's principal scientific advisor. We did it deliberately, set out to what he called dehouse the German civilian population as an act of war. And it was also quite deliberate that the targets chosen were working class areas, because if you want to bomb residential areas of cities, you have much more effect if you bomb the closely packed poorer areas than you do if you bomb the middle class areas. So we were bombing the Social Democrats, who had been the people who'd stood up to Hitler right up until 1933. And that's what we did. And it was totally militarily ineffective. And the people say, oh, Dresden, yes, Dresden was terrible. It's not just Dresden. There's hardly a city in Germany, including many which had absolutely no military capacity whatsoever, which we bombed. And if you read, and I extract very briefly from an account actually written by Max Hastings in his wonderful book, Bomber Command, of the bombing of Darmstadt. Just read a very brief account of what the people of Darmstadt underwent when we bombed them. I don't think you'll be able to countenance it. You won't be able to tell yourself this was justified, this was all right. It's unspeakable. And we did it. And it was wrong. And there was no military excuse for it, and there was no moral excuse for it. But say that anywhere in public, especially in conservative audiences, and see what you get.
I'm interested, all of this book is about exploding what you see as a sort of pervasive mythology about the Second World War. But if it is all mythology, why and how has it had such a potent hold on the collective imagination and history?
Well, remembering the Britain in which I grew up, and I first came to consciousness just across the Forth in Rosyth in the early 1950s. And I still remember a country badly bomb damaged, with a dirty, scraped, battered, and almost defeated look about it. And I think that for the adults of the post-war period, there was a strong physical feeling at the end of this war in which we had supposedly won, at least we were on the winning side, that Britain felt for many years very much more like a defeated country. We still had rationing. The rebuilding of the country took years to happen. We were more or less bankrupt, particularly once the Americans stopped supporting us. And there was a great feeling of privation. And I suppose to comfort ourselves for the lack of physical, material reason to rejoice, we gave ourselves what you might call a spiritual reason to be pleased with what we'd done and to define this as the British Empire's finest hour and as a great victory and as a huge golden entry on the National Honours Board. And I think that had a lot to do with it initially. Later on, I think we found it very, very hard to cope with the national decline, particularly since Suez, with the fact that we aren't really an important country anymore, and so we like to hark back. And it's just bizarre things. At royal weddings, Lancaster bombers fly overhead. Can anybody explain to me the connection between a Lancaster bomber and a royal wedding?
They don't drop anything, though.
Well, if they did, they probably wouldn't hit anything. That was the problem. They flew off in the dark and they opened the bomb doors, and what happened. And unfortunately, from their point of view, if there was a large city, they would probably hit it. But the Butt Report, I'm using the titled Butt Report into British bombing before the great Arthur Harris offensive began, pretty much demonstrated that we weren't hitting anything with our night bombing at all.
Just before I bring the audience in, I'm curious, that there have been shed loads of books written about various aspects of the Second World War and histories of it, and as you mentioned earlier on, serial biographies of Churchill. Yeah. How much of these accounts has been rewritten and revised, and how much of it is fake news?
The problem with these things is what they leave out, I think. There is, everybody knows you can tell a story and you can leave awkward bits out, like those special children's. My brother always used to think it was very funny that we had what was called a cadet edition of Nicholas Montserrat's Cruel Sea in our house. It had all the really grisly bits left out. I think we've been given a cadet edition of the Second World War in the same way, all the grisly bits left out, because people confront these things. In fact, the episode that I mentioned earlier of the high-speed secret gold convoys taking huge amounts of gold bullion to Fort Knox, where as far as I know it still is. In the major histories of the Second World War, this event simply isn't alluded to. But it seems to me that when a country is stripped of its national wealth in solid material form, you should mention it, but people just leave it out. I think it would be unpopular.
And Churchill?
Well, Churchill, there's a difficulty with Churchill. There's no question that I don't think anyone else could have done what he did in June 1940, and he is indispensable in British history for that reason. But I think everybody who's serious about the history of the war knows that after that, his conduct of the war was not particularly distinguished. I dwell in the book upon the Singapore episode, in which he behaved appallingly in many ways and sent, amongst other things, 2 fine ships to certain doom against the advice of everybody who knew anything about naval warfare, and failed. Do you know that, for instance, that we was at the height of our supposed invasion peril in the summer of 1940, Churchill was sending military equipment and I believe high-quality men to North Africa. It tells you something about his estimation of the invasion danger. But also during the initial threat to Malaya, which he didn't really believe in, he was again reinforcing North Africa and indeed sending tanks and planes to Stalin in preference to sending them there. This resulted, I think, almost certainly in the most catastrophic defeat of British arms in our long history, and the marching off into hellish captivity of large numbers of British and Australian troops. And a shocking event, which, as I say, we don't talk about, as we don't talk about the catastrophic defeat of the PQ-17 convoy, for instance, another major British military disaster which is muttered about but not spoken about, because it doesn't fit with the glorious, boyish idea of what it was like. But the problem is these things catch up with you in the end. You can only delude yourself for a while. And how many credit cards can you max out before it finally comes around that you haven't got any money? And how much can you kid yourself that you're a world power until you finally realize that even the Belgians don't really care what you say.
On that rather dispiriting note, I think we'll have the lights up if we may. Thank you. Now, I did promise you that Peter was going to say absolutely nothing of a controversial nature, and I'm sure you'll agree that he kept to that. He kept to that script. So could we have we've got several mics now, I think, inflation and all that. We've got 2 quite close by there. If we could start with them, please.
Yeah, thank you. It was a bit like listening to a SNP politician, looking for everything that's wrong with Britain. And I don't agree. I mean, I know Britain's not perfect.
I'm so sorry. Could you speak a little bit further from the microphone?
Further from the microphone.
It may be my great age. Yeah, a bit further, because it may be my great age, or it may be because we're in Scotland, but I
think
can't
he'd like you
actually
to
make
move
it.
to where he can't hear you.
Yeah, sure. I'll put it in my pocket. Yeah, as I say, listen to an SNP politician, looking for negatives and everything. I don't agree with anything you said, but don't disagree with anything you said, I should say. But I don't think any country can survive. Keep going back and going back. But I mean, Tony Blair apologised for anything about happening in Britain. And you, as I said, just move on with life. I think Britain's great.
I think we'll move to the other question.
Hello there, thanks. Talking about the British stopping the repayments to the United States, something that I think had a huge impact on future relationships. Can you just perhaps briefly say how that decision was made? How did they just sort of say, wake up one day and say, "Hi, we're going to stop paying you guys," or what? How did it come about?
There was a general crisis in reparations. The Germans were supposed to repay us because of the damage they'd done to us during the war, and all kinds of other countries owed us money, and they stopped paying. And so what basically happened was that the whole system of repayments throughout the world stopped. We owed the Americans a colossal amount of money, and we had pretty much become their pensioners by 1916. And by the way, this is the best description of that process is in Adam Tooze's fantastic book about the Second World War, The Deluge, which everybody should read. It is the best history book published in recent years.
Hey, hang on, you're trying to sell yours from me.
Yeah, I know, but I think that when you come across anything as good as this, you have to tell people about it. But a lot of it went on about something called The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark. It was because of a lot of 1914 anniversary books a few years ago. I couldn't understand why. Tooze's book is tremendous, but it explains how we had become so totally indebted to the United States quite early on in the war. And it is enormous debt. I can't remember what it is. There are different ways of calculating how many billions it is now, but we could never begin to repay it. And you get a lot of coughing and shuffling if you ask the Treasury about it to this day. But we just stopped. And that's why the Americans passed the Neutrality Act, and so that they would no longer supply anybody, and that meant us, with weapons on credit, and which led to the very rapid soaking up of what wealth we had on buying stuff from it, and then eventually to the bankruptcy hearings in the Senate and Lend-Lease. And the British ambassador to Washington at the time, Lord Lothian, was famous for flying back from England and saying to a bunch of American reporters, "We're broke. What we want is your money." Which was the clearest, most honest statement of our position ever made. And the truth is, we still are. We still do.
Lady in the second row here. And if anybody else wants to speak, could you put up your hands now? Somebody already got a mic there. If you could start, and then we could give this lady the mic next. Thank you.
I don't know. It's working. Good. Thank you, Mr. Peter Hitchens, for this presentation. I've been following you, of course, like everyone here, for years. My name is Joel Rakes. I write for the millions of American journalists, but I'm stationed in Kiev, have been there for about 27 years. And interesting to this in your comments about, it's a tiny point, about the reference of we defeated the world's greatest tyrant by siding with the world's second greatest tyrant. And this isn't just a question of taxonomy, but the question of if perhaps there's not some inconsistency in that statement by calling Stalin number 2 because of the tremendous British sacrifice, particularly in fighting directly Hitler, in that Stalin in Soviet and followed by Russian abuses, brutality, is somewhat overlooked because of that. It's somewhat more distant, and therefore not as immediate in.
And your question?
Well, the question is exactly that. Are you not participating somewhat in a perpetuation of that mythology that you, I believe, critique so rightly in this book? Aren't you perpetuating a mythology by saying, you know, the big fight was Germany? And for Britain, perhaps it was, but Germany is now a neutralized force, while Russia continues to exert what it always has.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no. And also Germany is not really a neutralized force. What's happened in Europe since the Second World War is that countries have recognized, and what's happened really since the Nuremberg tribunals outlawed aggressive war as a political method, is that countries in the supposedly civilized world have used other methods for self-aggrandizement. I mean, my own view, many times expressed, is that the European Union is the continuation of Germany by other means. It is astonishing how very similar its foreign policies are to those adumbrated by Friedrich Naumann in his Mitteleuropa and by Bettmann Hollweg in his September program in 1914. The general direction of the European Union is very much Wilhelmine foreign policy continued, and for like so good, I prefer peaceful self-aggrandizement to warlike self-aggrandizement. I don't like seeing people killed, and if you have to have a dominant power in Europe, and it has to be Germany, which it does, then this is a much better way of arranging it than was attempted in 1914 or 1939. But Germany hasn't gone away. Russia, on the other hand, is a shell. It's hollowed out. It has the gross domestic products of Italy. And is not capable of any serious threat to any of its neighbours. And we get ourselves, half the point of my book and half the point of everything I say at the moment is to try and warn against the ludicrous new Cold War frenzy against the alleged Russian threat. Moscow has actually voluntarily and without military defeat withdrawn from hundreds of thousands of square miles of territory in Europe and Asia since 1991, and has only under extreme provocation reacted to an attempt to destabilize and deneutralize Ukraine after many years of warning. So no, I don't buy that at all. As for the unconsciousness of the Russian aspect of the war, my father's main experience of the Second World War was slogging between the Orkneys and Murmansk on those convoys. So I'm pretty aware of the Russian aspect of the war and have been since I was very small.
Lady in the second row.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned, I'm over here. Hi.
It's difficult, you know.
I know. I'll help wherever I can. You mentioned one of the promises that Britain made that was that it could never keep to Poland. And I was wondering what other promises Britain made to other countries to help it win in the war that you felt that maybe are having repercussions even today. For example, when I've read about the Balfour Agreement and Sykes-Picot Agreement, they seem to be directly in conflict with each other.
Well, there are many. Britain has a habit of making promises to people that it never intends to keep or could not conceivably keep. One of the least famous, which ought to be most famous, was the British promise to Denmark in the 1860s to come to its aid if attacked, which Lord Palmerston, that supposed jingo and super patriot, oiled his way out of by simply saying, no, actually it's not convenient at the moment, the weather's all wrong and we can't help, and got away with it, and nobody remembers it, which is the interesting thing. So all this stuff about if we do this, if we let down these people, it will be permanent dishonor and this country will sink into the mire of dishonor for the rest of history. It's not true. We let down the Danes and nobody cares and nobody remembers. The Balfour Agreement, which is broadly irrelevant to my book in almost every way but one, we did make a promise. The Sykes-Picot Agreement doesn't seem to me to be quite as contradictory to it as people say, because it was made on the basis of inadequate knowledge of the outcome of the war. But the breach of the Balfour Agreement, which was most significant, which we made, was the 1939 White Paper, in which we more or less banned Jews from migrating to what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. And this shocking action, undertaken for wholly cynical and cowardly reasons, completely undermines, again, what always seems to me to be the bizarre view held by, amongst others, the Prince of Wales, that Britain went into the Second World War to save the Jews of Europe. Well, if we did do that, then it wasn't very successful. But in fact, there's no evidence that we did. So at the time when, by leaving the gates of Palestine open, we could have saved huge numbers of European Jews, we slammed those gates shut. During the war, at the notorious Bermuda Conference, we repeated that, when at immense personal risk, the truth about the death camps was smuggled out of the German Empire and reached London. The response of the Foreign Office was to refer to wailing Jews, and any attempt to bomb, to get the authorities to stop bombing German civilians and instead to bomb the railway lines into the death camps was resisted. So the whole idea that we did that for that reason is fatuous. The truth is that by defeating Hitler, the Allies did indeed end the massacre of European Jews, but not until after quite a lot of them had been massacred. So there was a sort of coincidence of aim, but it wasn't the purpose of the war, and we should stop pretending to ourselves that somehow or other we went to war to save Anne Frank, because we didn't. And it is a very, again, my book details statements of people who hold this belief, and it is a commonly held belief. One other remark about this. We very often are told about the Kindertransport, and it's frequently celebrated now, and there is no question at all that it was, of course, a very great thing that those children were rescued from Hitler's grasp when they were. But think about it just for a moment and recognize that these were the children only. In all cases, their parents were left weeping on the station platforms, saying goodbye to them, and almost all of them died. And again, we were not, at that time, particularly enthusiastic about rescuing the Jews of Europe, and we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back all that much for having saved them later. And I do tire of this a bit. It's not, no, it isn't, we're being too kind to ourselves about our behavior.
There's a gentleman just behind you, if you could hand the mic there, thank you very much. And then one up there, thank you. We'll just do this one first and then we'll come up to that gentleman.
Does your book explain in any way the loss of HMS Hood, which blew up in contact with the Bismarck, especially when we'd lost 3 battle cruisers in exactly the same circumstances at Jutland?
It does explain by reference actually to some extracts from diaries by Admiral Louis Le Bailly, who was an engineering officer. It does explain how the Royal Navy had become, during the interwar period, a whited sepulchre, which looked absolutely splendid and magnificent, but was in reality not very well equipped to fight. This is something to say which Neville Chamberlain had begun to put right in the late 30s, but the Hood was still, like the poor Repulse, which was also sent to her death, was still not equipped for modern warfare. So it mentions the episode of the Hood, but not in great detail. If you want to know more about the shocking state of the Navy, then Louis Le Bailly is probably your man. He recounts one occasion when the Hood, which used to go from country to country displaying its enormous size and its beautiful lines to impressed foreigners, attempted to train and fire its 15-inch guns. And they came off their bearings because they were so heavily rusted. And they had to use the ship's tug-of-war team to get them back onto their bearings. It was a complete catastrophe. It was, as I say, many of these ships were whited sepulchres. It was not. It was a historically powerful navy decaying. And we have, in many cases, the same problem today. And the pathetic state of Her Majesty's Navy at the moment, many of ships which we ceaselessly send into warm seas are incapable of functioning in warm water. And large numbers of extremely modern frigates are tied up alongside because they cannot move. And yet we boast of ourselves as a major power. The only thing which makes us look strong is the Russian Navy, which appears to use wood-burning stoves to power its aircraft carriers, and whose planes fall into the sea when they try to take off, which is not a state we've yet reached, but we're nearly there. But yeah, it mentions it, but it's not a major theme of it. It's a short book.
We do have aircraft carriers without any aircraft, of course. So, gentlemen, there's three now, I think, but somebody's got the mic, I think, up there.
I thought you made a very interesting point about the invasion plans for Britain in 1940. Do you think that part of the reason why Britain wasn't invaded was because Hitler had already turned his attention to Barbarossa and invading Russia?
I think Hitler's attention had always been turned towards Russia. I think Hitler's main policy had always been, just as indeed pre-Hitler foreign policy, had always been in the East. Ukraine is a vital target, has always been a vital target of German foreign policy. And the Ukraine, and therefore the dismemberment of the Western European parts of Russia and the Baltic countries and the Caucasus as well. We were only in the war because we were a threat on the other flank. We were not the prime target. It's very interesting in how little interest Hitler took, apart from plundering them, in his Western conquests in 1940. So yeah, I think there's no question. But the other thing is this, of course, seaborne invasion is a fantastically difficult thing to do. And even the immensely well-prepared, hugely well-equipped invasion of 1944, those in charge of it were so afraid that it would fail that, as you know, Eisenhower wrote a special statement which he was ready to issue if the whole thing had been defeated. And it was too perilous. The other thing is that, and this is the other part of the problem of the Nazi-Soviet part of the war. If Hitler had managed to defeat the Soviet Union, then of course 1940 would have been repeated, only in far worse circumstances, because we would have had nowhere to turn. And the pressure on us would have been so great that my suspicion is that had Hitler defeated Stalin, then Churchill would have been removed from office by conservative politicians, so that a peace could have been reached. But one has to speculate about that. But that never happened. That was the real threat to us, was a German victory in the East, which didn't take place.
If you could put your hands up again, the people who had their hands up will get the mic along to you. Can we get two mics operational, please? Thanks very much. Carry on.
Do you think, despite the morally questionable and incompetent nature of the British government that you mentioned, the victory that continues to hold the public imagination is of the individual sacrifice of the men who fought in the war?
No. The more you hear about the actual individual effect of military death on the families it touched, the more distressing it is. Of course, individual valor is a tremendously moving and inspiring thing. I think anybody who's encountered it or read in detail of it or benefits from it can never belittle it. I remain very moved by it, but I don't think they're the same thing. And why were there was the great Philip Zeck cartoon in the Daily Mirror at the end of the war showing a bandaged soldier coming out of the ruins of Europe, presenting the politicians with peace and saying, "Here you are, don't lose it again." From the point of view of the people, war is always disaster. War means broken families, war means orphans, war means widows, war means destroyed homes, war means rationing, shortage, frustrated ambition, years eaten by the locust, and at the end of it, high taxes. I don't think any individual benefits from it. I think, obviously, a country has to defend itself when it's attacked. That's the fundamental kind of just war which everybody can support. But wars which are fought for other more complicated reasons are not so easy to defend. I was filled with anger at every occasion, and they came pretty much past my front door, on every occasion when soldiers came back from Afghanistan, because I could not see why they had been sent there. And I respected totally their courage and discipline, but I could not defend the government which had sent them there, and I still can't. And we've got in the habit in this country of having politicians who say to the public, "We have this terrible enemy, we must fight him." And he doesn't mean we, he means they, the armed forces over there. They must go out and fight. And that was the basis of Kosovo, which I still, as I say, think was disastrously wrong, and of Iraq, and of the Libyan adventure, which I think possibly will in the end turn out to be the most damaging of all fought at the time with public support. And I think the public needs to learn to be much more cautious about this. And I say, I often have a reason to feel scared. But on certain occasions, when opposing with what I can of fact and logic, the strong establishment desire for a British and indeed a Western intervention in Syria bizarrely on the side of the same people we would arrest if we found them in Birmingham. When I actually oppose this, I find myself facing such fury from various quarters and attempts to smear me of such vigor that I do worry that we're a country which is far too easily seduced by the fake glamour of war, and I think we should get out of that.
We're just going to have time for one last question there, whoever's got the mic. Thank you, but could you make it very brief, please?
Peter, good afternoon.
Well, I'm sure there are lots of questions, and the really good news is that Peter's going to be in the signing tent, and you can talk to him to your heart's content. But I've got to get out of here by 1:45, otherwise I'll get.
Well, let's try and get them both in.
I'll get sacked.
I'll be quick with you.
Okay, I'll go very quickly. Peter, good afternoon. You mentioned political wars. Oh, by the way, I should self-identify as a member of the Labour Party and Momentum. You mentioned political wars there, and surely the biggest political war is the discredited, and I know you'll agree with me, the discredited war on drugs. But we need to do something about that war. It's killing millions of people around the world as much as any.
Let me refer you.